The Ancien Regime, France before the storm. The structure of French society, estates and privilege. France, in the years leading up to the Revolution, was a kingdom deeply shaped by hierarchy, a society bound by tradition, religion, and law, all centered around an ancient framework known as the estates. This social structure had been in place for centuries, a rigid system that divided the population not by wealth or ability, but by birth and title. There were three main estates in this world: the first estate, the second estate, and the third estate. Each one represented a distinct social class, with different privileges, duties, and expectations. The first estate was the clergy, the priests, bishops, and abbots who not only served the church but also held immense influence in matters of law, education, and land ownership. The church, through the first estate, collected tithes, owned vast lands, and maintained a spiritual and political grip over the people. The second estate consisted of the nobility. These were the dukes, counts, marquises, and lords who inherited titles and estates, often passed down through generations. They held high-ranking positions in the military, the court, and the government, and they enjoyed freedoms that ordinary people could scarcely imagine. They were mostly exempt from taxes and had the right to collect dues from peasants who lived on their lands. And then there was the third estate, the vast, sprawling remainder of France's population. They were the peasants, the artisans, the merchants, and the rising bourgeoisie. Numbering over 95% of the total population, this estate bore the weight of taxation, military conscription, and the burdens of labor. They were the ones who toiled in the fields, crafted goods in small workshops, and ran the markets and cities. Despite their numbers, their voices were scarcely heard in the halls of power. This division of society created a deep and growing imbalance. The top two estates, though smaller in number, lived comfortably under a canopy of privilege, while the third estate struggled under a sky of obligation and exclusion. Laws favored the elite. Opportunities were limited. And in this stillness of inequality, the seeds of revolution began to take root. But for now, the system endured. It was maintained by tradition, reinforced by religion, and accepted as the natural order of things. Children were born into their estate, lived within it, and often died as they began, without ever stepping beyond its bounds. And so, France, in the era before the Revolution, was a land of three estates, three separate realities, stitched together into one kingdom, moving quietly but inevitably toward a moment of reckoning. Life in rural France, peasants and land. Beyond the elegant facades of cities and the glitter of the royal court, most of France's people lived in the countryside. Over 80% of the population were peasants, farmers, laborious, and villagers who lived off the land and in deep connection to the rhythms of nature. Life in rural France was simple, but not easy. It was a life shaped by the seasons, the soil, and the mercy of the weather. A peasant's home was often a small stone or timber structure, modest and dim. Inside, families slept on straw mattresses, cooked over open hearths, and rose before dawn to tend to the fields. Their days were long and laborious, filled with plowing, sowing, harvesting, and caring for livestock. Men worked the land, women maintained the home, and children helped as soon as they were able. Every season brought new tasks, and survival depended on the success of the harvest. The land they farmed often did not belong to them. Most peasants worked on land owned by noble landlords or the church. In return for the right to live and work there, they paid rent or offered a portion of their crops. These obligations could be burdensome, and on top of that, they paid taxes to the king, tithes to the church, and tolls to local lords for using mills, bridges, and roads. In times of good weather and fair harvests, rural life moved steadily. But when crops failed, as they often did due to droughts or floods, famine followed. Starvation, disease, and desperation would sweep through villages like wind through wheat. The winter of 1788 to 89, for example, was bitter and cruel, leaving thousands cold and hungry. Grain prices soared, and bread, the essential food of the poor, became unaffordable. Still, life in the countryside was not without its gentler rhythms. People celebrated festivals tied to the seasons, gathered for local markets, and attended Mass on Sundays. There was a deep sense of community, a shared struggle, and a simple pride in hard work and tradition. But beneath this quiet surface, frustration was slowly building. A feeling that the burdens were too heavy, the rules too rigid, and the rewards too few. For the peasant, the ancien regime was not a system of grandeur, but one of survival, day by day, harvest by harvest, always beneath the shadow of lords and taxes. The nobility, power, wealth, and isolation. The nobility of pre-revolutionary France existed in a world almost entirely apart from that of the common people. While peasants labored in fields and merchants counted coins in crowded towns, the nobles lived surrounded by tradition, privilege, and a carefully maintained sense of superiority. They were the descendants of warriors, of kings' companions, of ancient landholders. Their names were old, their titles inherited, and their status protected by law and custom. There were roughly 300,000 members of the Second Estate, a small fraction of the overall population, yet they owned nearly a quarter of the land in France. Many of them lived on vast rural estates, collecting rents and dues from the peasantry who worked the land. Others lived in the royal court or in fashionable townhouses in Paris or provincial capitals, spending their days in salons, theaters, or the leisure of political intrigue. The nobility was not a uniform class. There were distinctions within distinctions. The noblesse d'épée, or nobility of the sword, claimed ancient martial origins, while the noblesse de robe had gained their titles through administrative or judicial service to the monarchy. While some noble families were fabulously wealthy, others were poor in all but title, holding on to their rank with great pride but little income. What united them was privilege. Nobles were exempt from many taxes. They held high offices in the military, the church, and government, and they often controlled local justice through their seigneurial courts. They could hunt on lands peasants farmed, hold exclusive rights to fish in rivers, and demand labor from local villagers through the corvée, or forced roadwork. Their world was protected by an invisible wall of deference, reinforced by centuries of tradition. And yet, for all their power, many nobles were strangely isolated. As Enlightenment ideas spread and the bourgeoisie grew in strength, the nobility became more defensive, clinging to titles and customs that seemed increasingly out of step with the times. Many saw the growing unrest but failed to understand its depth. They lived in a past that was fading, unable or unwilling to see the cracks forming beneath their feet. Thus, while the nobles danced at court and debated the proper form of a bow, the world outside their estates was beginning to shift in ways they could neither control nor comprehend. The clergy, church influence and corruption. The First Estate, the clergy, was more than just a religious body. It was one of the pillars of the Ancien regime. The Catholic Church in France owned vast amounts of land, enjoyed legal privileges, and played a powerful role in shaping public life. It was not merely a spiritual institution, it was a political and economic force. There were two kinds of clergy in France, the higher clergy and the lower clergy. The higher clergy, which included bishops and archbishops, were often drawn from noble families. They lived in comfort, sometimes even opulence, and controlled vast dioceses and monastic lands. These positions were often seen as rewards for noble birth rather than spiritual vocation. Many bishops lived far from the parishes they were supposed to serve, preferring the salons of Paris to the pulpits of provincial churches. The lower clergy, by contrast, were parish priests, cures, who lived among the people, ministered to the sick, performed baptisms and burials, and struggled with the same poverty as their flock. They often resented the wealth and detachment of the upper clergy. This internal divide would later have significant consequences as the revolution unfolded. The church collected tithes, a kind of tax, from the population, usually amounting to a tenth of one's income or produce. These tithes were supposed to support the local parish and its works, but often much of the money was redirected to the upper clergy or to the church's vast holdings. This system, too, bred resentment, especially in rural areas where peasants struggled to make ends meet. Still, religion was deeply woven into daily life. Most French people were devout. Religious festivals marked the calendar, church bells ordered the day, and priests were present at every major moment in life. But the Enlightenment had begun to question the authority of the church. Philosophers criticized its power, its wealth, and its role in censorship. Many saw it as a tool of oppression, a partner in maintaining the monarchy's control over the minds and hearts of the people. In the waning days of the Ancien regime, the church remained powerful, but that power was increasingly questioned. Its ancient privileges, once accepted without thought, now stood as symbols of inequality and injustice to a people slowly waking from obedience. Urban life, merchants, artisans, and the bourgeoisie. Beyond the castles and cathedrals, another France thrived in the cities. Urban life in the 18th century was a world of bustling markets, narrow alleyways, smoke from workshops, and the chatter of cafe tables. Here lived the artisans, shopkeepers, clerks, and, increasingly, the bourgeoisie, the middle class whose rise would become one of the revolution's great engines. Cities like Paris, Lyon, Bordeaux, and Marseille pulsed with energy. Streets were crowded with vendors selling bread, cloth, tools, and news. Bakers worked from dawn, blacksmiths hammered iron in courtyards, and merchants bargained over prices of silks, spices, and wine. The cities were noisy, lively, and unpredictable, filled with both opportunity and inequality. The bourgeoisie, a class of educated and often wealthy commoners, occupied a curious position. They were not nobles, and they lacked titles, yet many were wealthier than the aristocracy. They were lawyers, doctors, bankers, professors, and industrialists. They valued education, rational thought, and civic participation. They read the works of Voltaire and Rousseau, attended salons, and debated ideas of governance and reform. Many felt they deserved more political power, and resented the fact that they had none. Artisans and workers formed the bulk of the urban population. They were skilled in trades passed down through generations: carpentry, weaving, metalwork, and tailoring. They lived in modest quarters, often above or behind their workshops. Life was precarious. A bad harvest meant less bread, which meant higher prices, which meant unrest. Food shortages could spark protests or riots, as they had in earlier decades. The working poor, though not politically powerful, would become a potent force during the revolution. Urban life was also shaped by information. Printing presses churned out pamphlets, newspapers, and political tracts. Coffee houses became centers of gossip and debate. People were talking about taxes, about the king, about freedom. And in this atmosphere of conversation and growing consciousness, the flame of revolution found ready fuel. The role of women in pre-revolutionary France. In the world of the Ancien regime, a woman's role was largely defined by her class, her family, and the expectations placed upon her by both society and the church. Women had few legal rights and limited access to education, yet they played vital roles within the household, the community, and even the cultural life of the kingdom. For peasant women, life was filled with labor. From dawn to dusk, they worked alongside men in the fields, managed the household, cared for children, and produced food. They baked bread, spun thread, fetched water, and tended to animals. These women were the backbone of rural France, their work essential yet often invisible in the eyes of history. They had little voice in political matters but understood intimately the rhythms of the land and the challenges of survival. In the cities, working-class women took on roles as laundresses, seamstresses, servants, and shopkeepers. They filled the streets and markets, selling goods and laboring to support their families. They were also at the front lines when food became scarce, often the first to protest rising bread prices or demand justice for the poor. It was women who led the famous bread riots of the 1780s and who would later march on Versailles demanding food and reform. Among the bourgeoisie and nobility, women led more sheltered lives but still faced limitations. A girl's education, if any, focused on religion, manners, and domestic skills. Marriages were often arranged, prioritizing family alliances over affection. Women were expected to manage the home and produce heirs. Yet some found influence in quieter ways, through salons, letters, and conversation. In the salons of Paris, noble and bourgeois women hosted gatherings where philosophers, writers, and thinkers exchanged ideas. These women, saloniers, helped shape the Enlightenment by fostering dialogue and encouraging debate. Though they could not vote or hold office, their homes became incubators for revolution. Thus, while the laws of the Ancien regime offered women little power, their presence was deeply felt, in kitchens and fields, in markets and salons, and later, in the streets where history would be made. The economy, crisis and debt. Beneath the surface of France's elegant facade, the economic foundations of the kingdom were crumbling. The late 18th century was a time of deepening fiscal crisis. The royal treasury was emptying, and the cost of maintaining the lavish court at Versailles, along with a string of costly wars, had drained the nation's wealth. The French monarchy had inherited centuries of debt, worsened by participation in the 7 Years' War and most recently, by its support of the American colonies in their war for independence. While this assistance helped to defeat Britain, it came at a steep cost. Nearly 1.3 billion livres borrowed, most of it through high-interest loans. The financial burden grew unbearable. At the same time, the system of taxation was inefficient and unjust. The wealthiest estates, the nobility and clergy, paid little or nothing, while the third estate bore nearly all the burden. Tax farming, a corrupt system where private collectors gathered taxes in exchange for a portion, enriched a few and enraged many. Peasants paid taille, land tax, gabelle, salt tax, and tithe to the church. Many struggled to feed their families. In the cities, inflation and unemployment created further unrest. A bad harvest in 1788 led to a sharp rise in bread prices. For the poor, bread was life, making up 60 to 80% of daily caloric intake. When bread became unaffordable, desperation followed. Attempts at reform failed. Finance ministers such as Turgot, Necker, and Calonne proposed changes, cutting court expenses, taxing the nobles, reforming tax collection. But each time, vested interests pushed back. The parliaments, powerful regional courts, blocked reforms. The king, fearing resistance, hesitated. By the end of the 1780s, France's economy was in a spiral. The state couldn't borrow more, taxes couldn't increase without revolt, and trust in royal leadership was fading. It was no longer just a crisis of money, it was a crisis of confidence. The people believed something was wrong. The future, once taken for granted, now seemed uncertain. And in that uncertainty, the soil of revolution became fertile. Enlightenment ideals and intellectual awakening. While the people of France struggled under a failing system, ideas were beginning to stir that would change the world. The 18th century was the age of enlightenment, a period of intellectual awakening that questioned tradition, authority, and the nature of power itself. At the heart of the Enlightenment was a belief in reason. Philosophers argued that human beings could use logic and science to understand the world, improve society, and govern themselves justly. They challenged the divine right of kings, the privileges of the nobility, and the unquestioned authority of the church. Thinkers like Voltaire criticized religious intolerance and superstition. He championed freedom of speech and individual rights. Montesquieu wrote of the separation of powers, an idea that would later shape constitutional governments. Rousseau, with his powerful notion of the social contract, argued that government must reflect the general will of the people. These ideas were not confined to dusty books. They spread through pamphlets, journals, and public readings. Enlightenment salons, often hosted by women, became centers of discussion. Coffee houses buzzed with talk of liberty and reform. Even in rural areas, simplified versions of Enlightenment texts reached literate peasants and merchants. The American Revolution, with its Declaration of Independence and Republican ideals, inspired many in France. It proved that an old regime could be overthrown, that a people could rise and claim a new kind of freedom. But the Enlightenment was not only political. It reshaped art, science, education, and human rights. It told people that they could question, that they could think for themselves. In this atmosphere, the Ancien regime began to look increasingly out of place. Its rigid hierarchies and inherited privileges seemed not natural, but irrational. The world was changing, and France would not be immune. Versailles and the royal court. At the center of France's monarchy stood the Palace of Versailles, a grand, gilded monument to royal power. Built by Louis XIV and expanded by his successors, Versailles was more than a residence. It was a symbol of the king's authority, a stage on which the pageantry of absolutism played out each day. The court at Versailles was a world unto itself. It followed elaborate rituals and unspoken rules. Every moment, from the king's rising, the lever, to his bedtime, coucher, was attended by nobles eager to show loyalty and gain favor. Appearances mattered. Clothing, manners, and speech were all carefully observed. A misplaced gesture could end a career. A well-timed compliment could win a pension or post. King Louis XVI was a man of good intentions but weak resolve. He loved hunting and locksmithing, but struggled with decision-making. His wife, Queen Marie Antoinette, became a symbol, rightly or wrongly, of extravagance and detachment. Her spending, fashion, and private retreats like the Petit Trianon fueled public anger. Versailles was expensive to maintain. While the country faced starvation, the court consumed vast sums for banquets, balls, and jewels. The disconnect between court life and the lives of ordinary people grew too wide to ignore. Criticism began to appear in pamphlets and satire. The people viewed Versailles not as a center of leadership, but as a symbol of indifference, a golden bubble floating above their misery. When the revolution began, it would not be long before the gates of Versailles would open, not to courtiers, but to the people. The road to revolution, signs of unrest. By the end of the 1780s, all the pieces for revolution were in place. Economic crisis, social inequality, political failure, and the spread of Enlightenment ideals had created a storm cloud that loomed dark over France. Bread riots were becoming more frequent. In the countryside, peasants attacked tax offices and burned records of feudal dues. In the cities, people whispered of change. Pamphlets circulated calling for liberty and justice. Trust in the king and nobility was evaporating. The Estates General, a body that had not met since 1614, was summoned in 1789 to address the financial crisis. Each of the three estates would send representatives. Hopes were high that reform would follow. But when the third estate arrived, they found themselves sidelined, given only one vote despite representing the vast majority of the population. They broke away. They declared themselves the National Assembly. They took the tennis court oath, vowing not to disband until they had written a constitution. It was the first open act of revolution. Across France, people watched and waited. Something had changed. The old order was no longer untouchable. The Ancien Regime, once so solid, had begun to crack. And through those cracks, the light of revolution would soon pour. The spark, 1789 and the fall of the Bastille. The calling of the Estates General. In the late months of 1788, a deep winter cloaked the French countryside in stillness. The air was sharp, and the land barren. Villagers huddled by faint fires, wrapped in worn fabrics, murmuring about strange news from the capital. The king, Louis XVI, had summoned the Estates General, a gathering so old that most in France had only read of it in dusty tomes or heard of it in stories passed between generations. It had last met in the year 1614. That distant age was long gone, replaced by modern frustrations and a kingdom teetering on the edge of financial ruin. The king's court had no more gold, his lenders had grown silent, and his people restless. Desperate for solutions, Louis turned to history and summoned this ancient assembly of France's three estates: the clergy, the nobility, and the commoners. The announcement rippled through towns and hamlets. There would be elections, they said. Delegates would be chosen, and grievances recorded. In parishes and provinces, people gathered, uncertain of what lay ahead. Farmers, bakers, artisans, and merchants all took part in writing the cahiers de doléances, the lists of wrongs, dreams, and demands. They asked for simple things: the right to hunt, to work, to eat, to worship freely, to be taxed fairly, to be heard. The first estate, the clergy, came robed in tradition. The second estate, the nobility, glittered with lineage and entitlement. The third estate, the great, laboring mass, stepped forward in silence but with purpose. Their clothes were plain, but their minds sharp and voices steady. In May of 1789, Versailles opened its gilded doors to this assembly. Yet within days, it was clear, the old rules still bound them. Each estate would vote as a bloc, meaning the privileged few could easily overrule the will of the many. The Third Estate balked. They walked out, and in doing so, changed the course of French history. By mid-June, they declared themselves the National Assembly, the legitimate voice of the people. When locked out of their chamber days later, they gathered instead in a nearby tennis court. There, beneath the soft beams of filtered sunlight, they raised their hands and swore the tennis court oath, a solemn vow not to disband until France had a constitution. Power had begun to shift, not with gunfire, but with an oath. The tennis court oath. It was June 20th, 1789. A quiet summer morning at Versailles. Dew still clung to the hedges as guards milled about the palace grounds. Inside, the deputies of the Third Estate found their usual meeting hall locked and guarded. Officially, it was closed for repairs. Unofficially, the message was clear. They were not welcome. But the mood among the deputies was not one of submission. They had declared themselves the National Assembly, and with that declaration came a new sense of purpose, of legitimacy. Finding the doors barred, they wandered briefly before relocating to a nearby building, a simple indoor tennis court known as the Jeu de Paume. Its high walls echoed with the footsteps of 576 men determined to stand firm. Inside, the air was dense with anticipation. The deputies stood in rows, solemn and still, until Jean-Sylvain Bailly, their chosen president, stepped forward. He read aloud a vow. It was not lengthy, but it was binding. They pledged never to separate, to remain together until a new constitution had been written for the French people. They raised their hands, almost all of them. In a wave, arms lifted and eyes met. It was a moment of stillness, yet its impact was seismic. One man, Joseph Martin Dorch, refused to sign, but his was a lonely defiance amid a sea of unity. In the days that followed, support for the assembly grew. Clergy from the First Estate began to defect. Even some nobles, moved by conscience or calculation, joined. The king hesitated, then grudgingly recognized the assembly. But it was too late to contain the spark. What had begun as a gathering of estates was fast becoming a revolution of ideas, of identity. The people were awakening, not just in Versailles, but across the kingdom. Rumors, fears, and the rise of the people. As the summer of 1789 unfolded, a sense of unease swept through Paris. The city hummed with rumor. People gathered in cafes and public gardens, whispering that troops were marching toward the capital, that the king was preparing a coup, that bread would run out, that enemies of the people had taken control of the court. Fueling the fear was the sudden dismissal of Jacques Necker, the finance minister widely seen as sympathetic to the Third Estate. His removal on July 11th ignited a firestorm. Parisians took to the streets. They feared the worst, that the king, backed by his foreign regiments, would dissolve the assembly by force. Crowds grew. Some marched to City Hall to demand arms. Others sought out gunsmiths or raided armories. By July 13th, the entire city was in uproar. The National Guard was hastily formed, led by the Marquis de Lafayette. But it lacked weapons. Where, then, could the people find gunpowder? Eyes turned toward a fortress. The storming of the Bastille. On the morning of July 14th, 1789, the sun rose over Paris as it always had. But in the eastern quarter, near the Seine, thousands of Parisians gathered outside the Bastille, an imposing medieval fortress with tall stone towers and deep, shadowed windows. The Bastille had long been a symbol of royal tyranny. Few people were imprisoned there anymore, but its name evoked centuries of arbitrary arrests, secret trials, and injustice. Its thick walls, manned by a small garrison, stood like a challenge to the people. That day, the crowd was not there for a protest. They came for the gunpowder stored inside. As negotiations failed, the crowd pressed forward. A firefight broke out. The defenders, unsure of their orders, fired into the masses. Dozens were killed. Blood stained the cobblestones. But the people did not retreat. Instead, they surged forward, reinforced by defectors and armed citizens. After hours of combat, the Bastille's gates fell. The prison governor, Delaunay, was captured and killed. His head, severed and placed on a pike, was paraded through the streets. The Bastille had fallen. Its strategic importance was minimal, but its symbolic meaning was immense. The people had taken on the monarchy, and won. That night, Paris did not sleep. Fires burned, bells rang, and songs were sung. All across France, word spread like wildfire. The people had risen. The revolution had begun. The Great Fear. In the wake of the Bastille's fall, fear spread not just in Paris, but across the countryside. Rumors flew faster than reason. Bands of brigands, it was said, were roaming the land, looting villages and burning crops. Foreign armies were marching in support of the nobles. Aristocrats were poisoning the wells. None of it was true, yet belief in the rumors was enough. In province after province, peasants armed themselves with whatever they could find: scythes, pitchforks, old muskets. But instead of attacking phantom invaders, they turned on the symbols of their oppression. They stormed chateaux. They burned tax records. They forced lords to flee or sign away their feudal rights. The old order was not just being questioned, it was being dismantled. This wave of panic and rebellion became known as the Great Fear. For weeks, chaos reigned. And though the violence subsided by August, the message was clear. The people were no longer willing to accept their old burdens. They would never go back. The August Decrees. In the calm after the chaos of the Great Fear, France stood at a strange crossroads. The countryside still smoldered, and the air remained heavy with ash and uncertainty. Yet within the great halls of the National Assembly in Versailles, a different kind of fire had been lit, one of reform, swift and total. It was the night of August 4th, 1789. What began as a meeting to discuss rural disorder quickly transformed into something else entirely. One by one, deputies, including nobles, stood to renounce their ancient privileges. They spoke of liberty, of fraternity, of equality. Titles, feudal dues, hunting rights, and tithes, all were cast aside. The assembly stayed awake long into the night. What unfolded was not chaos, but consensus. With trembling hands and rising voices, they passed the August Decrees. In them, the old feudal order was declared dead. No longer would a peasant owe forced labor to his lord. No longer would noblemen enjoy special exemptions from taxes. The hierarchy of birth had begun to crumble. These decrees were sweeping, noble, and symbolic. Yet their real-world effects would take time. Implementation lagged, resistance flared, but the declarations stood firm. In a single summer night, France had begun the task of unmaking centuries of inherited power. Outside the assembly, hope blossomed. For a moment, the dream of a truly equal France did not seem so distant. The Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen. Later that same month, on August 26, 1789, the National Assembly unveiled a document destined to echo across centuries. The Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen. Penned by men such as the Marquis de Lafayette and influenced by Enlightenment thinkers like Rousseau and Montesquieu, the Declaration was a manifesto, not of war, but of principle. It declared that all men were born and remained free and equal in rights. That sovereignty rested with the people. That the law was an expression of the general will. That freedom of speech, religion, and press were sacred. It was both idealistic and radical. Gone were the divine rights of kings. In their place stood the rights of man. The Declaration was meant to be the moral compass of the revolution. It outlined what the Assembly hoped to build: a France of reason, justice, and civic virtue. Though women were not included in its promises, and slavery continued in the colonies, it marked a seismic shift in political thought. It became a mirror in which other nations, some admiring, some fearful, would see their own reflection. In quiet homes and crowded city squares, copies of the Declaration were read aloud. Citizens hung its words on walls and whispered them in prayers. It had given language to a revolution that had, until now, spoken in hunger and fire. The Women's March on Versailles. Autumn came to Paris with little mercy. Bread was scarce. Prices soared. Hunger gnawed at the bellies of families already stretched thin. The revolution had begun, but daily life remained cruelly unchanged for the poor. Then, on October 5, 1789, a crowd of market women gathered outside Paris City Hall. They came first with words, complaints, petitions, curses. Then they came with weapons, kitchen knives, muskets, pikes. Their numbers swelled. As the rain poured down, they began to march. Their destination, the Palace of Versailles. Some 6,000 strong, they walked for hours, soaked and shivering, driven not by politics but by hunger. Bread, they cried. To Versailles. Reaching the palace by nightfall, they confronted the royal guards and surrounded the gates. Deputies from the assembly came out to parley. Lafayette arrived with the National Guard to keep order. But by dawn, events had spiraled. A group of women breached the palace. In confusion and fear, guards were killed. The Queen, Marie Antoinette, fled her chambers just in time. The crowd demanded the royal family return to Paris. And so they did. In a slow procession, the king and queen rode at the front, followed by wagons of grain and the armed women. Behind them came deputies, soldiers, and songs. Versailles was left behind, the monarchy now a captive of its people. It was not just a march, it was a transfer of power. The royal family moves to Paris. The royal court, long the heart of France's grandeur, was now a shadow of itself. When the royal family entered Paris on October 6th, they were greeted not with cheers, but with grim silence and skeptical stares. No longer ensconced in their opulent palace at Versailles, Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette were relocated to the Tuileries Palace, a cold, urban residence nestled in the heart of the capital. There, they were watched closely, their movements restricted, their conversations noted. They remained king and queen in title, but their authority had withered. The court adapted uneasily. The palace echoed with the footsteps of guards, advisors whispered behind doors, and the queen, once resplendent at Versailles, wandered listlessly in unfamiliar halls. She sewed, she read, she waited. Meanwhile, the National Assembly moved to Paris as well, taking up residence in the nearby Manège. Debate continued daily, fueled now by the proximity of the people and their hunger for results. The city had become the center of power, but also of pressure. Louis XVI struggled. He was indecisive, wary, reluctant. He signed decrees and declarations, but often under duress. His private letters tell a story of fear and confusion, of a monarch no longer steering his realm but drifting within it. And yet, for the time being, he remained on the throne, a king in name, adrift in a sea of change. The new Paris, National Guard and tricolor. In this new Paris, the atmosphere crackled with tension and hope. Something irreversible had begun. The very skyline seemed to change. Towers were now topped not only with weathercocks but with flags, most notably the tricolor. Blue, white, and red, the colors of the revolution. Born of compromise, the tricolor flag combined the white of the monarchy with the blue and red of Paris. It became a symbol of unity, of rebellion tempered with order. It flew from buildings and was worn on cockades by citizens, soldiers, and children alike. Meanwhile, the National Guard, led by the esteemed Marquis de Lafayette, patrolled the streets. Their role was to maintain order, but also to protect the gains of the revolution. They were not royal troops. They were citizen soldiers, drawn from the people, sworn to the assembly and the nation. The old Paris of aristocrats and royal proclamations had become a city of clubs and pamphlets. Political societies flourished, the Jacobins, the Cordeliers. Printers worked through the night. Streets were filled with song and slogans. Every citizen seemed engaged in the business of revolution. Every corner echoed with debate. The people, once subjects, were becoming citizens. It was a fragile time, yet full of promise. And so, 1789 drew to a close. A year of collapse, of creation, of awakening. France would never be the same again. Revolution in motion, 1790 to 1791. The civil constitution of the clergy. As the sun of 1790 rose over France, a quiet war began, not of muskets and blood, but of parchment and pulpits. The revolution, ever widening in scope, now turned its gaze toward the ancient power of the Catholic Church. In July of that year, the National Assembly passed the Civil Constitution of the Clergy, a document that would sever centuries of sacred ties. The Constitution sought to nationalize the Church in France. Bishops and priests were now to be elected by citizens, their salaries paid by the state, and their loyalty sworn to the nation rather than to the Pope. Church lands had already been seized, sold to fund the revolutionary cause. Now, the very soul of the Church in France stood on unfamiliar ground. To revolutionaries, this was reason. To many others, it was blasphemy. Clergy across the country were ordered to take an oath to uphold this new order. Some complied, believing reform was necessary, but many refused. These were labeled non-uraying priests, seen as enemies of the nation. The divide deepened, between Paris and the provinces, between devout villagers and reforming urbanites. What began as policy soon became personal. Priests were driven from their parishes. Communities fractured. The revolution, once a movement of liberty, began to feel, to some, like persecution. The civil constitution of the clergy would haunt the revolution for years. It turned allies into adversaries and believers into rebels. And yet, the assembly stood firm. France would be remade, even at the cost of its faith. The flight to Varennes. In the summer of 1791, with the revolution deepening and his powers waning, King Louis XVI made a decision that would forever seal his fate. Under the cover of night on June 20th, he and his family slipped from the Tuileries Palace in disguise, hoping to flee Paris and reach royalist allies in eastern France. They traveled in a grand coach, too large, too slow, filled with trunks, gowns, and royal airs. The journey was meant to be secret, but delays and poor planning betrayed them. At the town of Varennes, just shy of the border, they were recognized and stopped. The family was brought back to Paris in silence. Crowds lined the roads, not in loyalty, but in judgment. What little trust remained in the monarchy was shattered. In the eyes of the people, the king had not merely fled, he had abandoned them. The assembly was thrown into turmoil. Monarchists and moderates were shaken. Republicans, once a fringe, gained ground. Though Louis remained nominally king, he had become a prisoner once more. The image of a benevolent monarch, reluctantly yielding to the will of the people, was gone. In its place stood a man revealed, hesitant, self-serving, and above all, disloyal to the cause. France would remember Varennes not as an escape, but as betrayal. The rise of the Jacobins. In taverns, salons, and makeshift clubs across Paris, voices rose in debate. The revolution was no longer the domain of courtiers and cautious reformers. New forces stirred, radical and relentless, chief among them, the Jacobins. Originally a political club of deputies and thinkers, the Jacobin Club grew rapidly after 1790. Its halls rang with the rhetoric of Rousseau and the resolve of Robespierre. What began as discussion turned to action. The Jacobins demanded not just reform, but transformation. They spoke of universal suffrage, the end of monarchy, and justice for all. They wore simple clothes, walked among the people, and embraced the language of the street. In contrast stood the Feuillants, moderates who wished to preserve the monarchy under a constitutional frame. But the Jacobins surged forward, drawing strength from discontent. Soon, branches of the Jacobin Club opened across France, becoming a network of political energy. Pamphlets, speeches, newspapers, all carried their message to the corners of the kingdom. They were not yet in control, but they were in motion. And in the revolution, motion was everything. The Champ de Mars massacre. The tension in Paris reached a terrible crescendo on July 17, 1791. Just weeks after the king's failed flight, thousands gathered on the Champ de Mars, a vast field once dedicated to celebration and now shadowed by unrest. Petitioners had come to demand the king's abdication. They wanted a republic, free of deception and monarchy. The air was thick with anger, slogans, and suspicion. Lafayette and the National Guard, once seen as protectors of the people, now stood in their way. Nervous, under pressure, and perhaps unprepared, the Guard opened fire on the crowd. Dozens were killed. The field that had once celebrated unity now drank the blood of citizens. This was not war, nor was it revolution in the streets. It was something darker. The revolution had turned on itself. In the aftermath, radicals were hunted, presses shut down, and voices silenced. The Jacobin club splintered. Robespierre withdrew from public view. It was a moment of pause, a shudder within the revolution. For the first time, citizens realized that liberty could bleed. The Constitution of 1791. Despite the turbulence, the National Assembly pressed forward. By September of 1791, a new constitution was ready, the first written constitution in France's long history. It declared France a constitutional monarchy. The king would remain, but his powers were strictly limited. Legislative power rested with a newly formed legislative assembly. Citizens, those who paid taxes, could vote. The judiciary was to be independent, rights protected. It was, on paper, a careful balance between order and liberty. Louis XVI accepted it, publicly. He swore allegiance before the assembly, his voice solemn, his gaze uncertain. For now, there was peace. The assembly dissolved itself soon after, making way for new elections. Many of its leaders, having spent years in revolution, stepped back, tired and wary. The hope was that with a constitution in place, France could now focus on stability, on governance, on bread. But France was changing too quickly, and not all were satisfied. Beyond the borders, émigré nobles stirred. In royal courts abroad, whispers of intervention grew louder. Inside the country, unrest simmered. The constitution had brought structure, but not resolution. New divisions, Girondins and Jacobins. With the new legislative assembly came new political factions, and at their center rose two dominant forces, the Girondins and the Jacobins. The Girondins, often from the provinces, were eloquent, moderate republicans who championed war against tyranny. They believed that spreading revolution abroad would strengthen it at home. Their vision was ambitious and outward-looking. The Jacobins, increasingly radicalized, focused inward. They saw enemies everywhere, in the court, in the clergy, even among former allies. Robespierre, their rising star, argued for moral virtue and unwavering resolve. The two groups clashed in speeches and pamphlets. Though both claimed the mantle of liberty, their paths diverged sharply. This division was not merely ideological, it reflected deeper fractures within French society. City versus country, radical versus moderate, terror versus legality. The revolution had once been a tide moving in one direction. Now, it surged in conflicting currents. Calls for war. By early 1792, cries for war echoed through the assembly. The Girondins led the charge, arguing that foreign kings threatened the revolution and that French arms would be greeted as liberators. War, they said, would unite the country and purify the revolution. Louis XVI, too, supported war, cynically. He believed French defeat would restore his power. The Jacobins, especially Robespierre, were skeptical. He feared war would serve the monarchy or the generals, not the people. Nevertheless, in April 1792, France declared war on Austria. The Revolutionary Army, ill-prepared and poorly led, stumbled into battle. The early results were disastrous. Panic spread. Rumors of betrayal multiplied. French soil, once the cradle of liberty, now became a battlefield. And so, a new phase of the revolution began. One fought not only in words and laws, but with cannons and blood. The rise of the sans-culottes. In the streets of Paris, another force emerged, the sans-culottes. They were workers, artisans, small shopkeepers, named for their plain trousers, in contrast to the silk breeches of the aristocracy. More than a fashion statement, it was a declaration. The sans-culottes were angry, hungry, and deeply political. They demanded price controls, universal suffrage, and an end to privilege, not tomorrow, but now. Their pressure on the government intensified. They filled galleries of the assembly, stormed city halls, and formed militias. Their influence grew, not through titles, but through terror and determination. They were the revolution's foot soldiers, feared by elites, courted by radicals, and impossible to ignore. Attack on the Tuileries. On August 10, 1792, the revolution reached a violent turning point. The sans-culottes, joined by rebellious National Guards, stormed the Tuileries Palace. They overwhelmed the king's Swiss Guard in brutal street fighting. Blood ran through the gardens. Bodies littered the halls. Louis XVI, seeking refuge with the Assembly, was arrested. The monarchy was suspended. A new governing body, the National Convention, was summoned. France had crossed a line. The revolution was no longer about reform. It was now about survival, and about power wrested by force. The king, once God's anointed, was now a prisoner of the people. The end of the monarchy. On September 21, 1792, the newly convened National Convention abolished the monarchy. France was declared a republic. Cheers rang through the chamber. Outside, crowds celebrated. Bells tolled. The centuries-old order had ended not with ceremony, but with uprising and decree. Louis Capet, as he was now called, would face trial for treason. But that is a tale for another chapter. The revolution, once a dream, was now a roaring fire, and it had only just begun. Republic Rising, 1792 to 1793. The September Massacres. The revolution had reached a fever pitch. In September 1792, as foreign armies threatened France's borders and fears of internal conspiracies reached a boiling point, the streets of Paris descended into chaos. Revolutionary fervor had become paranoia, and the line between justice and vengeance dissolved. Between September 2nd and 6th, mobs stormed prisons throughout the city. What began as an effort to preempt counter-revolution became a slaughter. Hundreds of prisoners, including clergy, nobles, political prisoners, and common criminals, were dragged from their cells and butchered. Priests were hacked to death. Women were impaled. Blood soaked the cobblestones of the city. Some watched in horror, others in silence. The authorities, overwhelmed or complicit, did little to stop the carnage. Jean-Paul Marat, the firebrand journalist, praised the violence. Robespierre remained largely silent. Danton justified it with the chilling words, "Let us be terrible, so the people will not have to be." It was not a battle. Evidence was presented. Letters, testimony, and most damning of all, the iron chest found in the Tuileries, containing documents that revealed secret dealings with foreign monarchies. The convention debated not his guilt, few doubted it, but his fate. Should he be imprisoned, banished, executed? On January 15, 1793, the convention voted. Louis was guilty. The next day, they decided his punishment. By a slim majority, the death sentence was passed. On January 21, 1793, at the Place de la Révolution, Louis XVI mounted the scaffold. He attempted to speak, but the drums rolled. The blade fell. The king was dead. The monarchy, in every sense, had been severed. Reaction to the king's execution. The king's execution sent shockwaves through Europe. In courts from London to Vienna, monarchs reeled. The revolution was no longer a French affair. It was now a threat to every throne. Britain, Spain, and the Dutch Republic joined Austria and Prussia in forming the First Coalition, a military alliance to contain revolutionary France. Inside the country, the execution divided the revolution's supporters. The Girondins, though they had voted for Louis's death, now hesitated at the pace of radicalism. The Montagnards surged ahead, emboldened by their triumph. Abroad, French émigrés called for vengeance. Within France, royalist uprisings flared, especially in the Vendée, a deeply Catholic and monarchist region. The revolution had crossed a Rubicon. There was no going back. War expands, France against Europe. In the early months of 1793, France found itself at war with nearly every major power in Europe. The First Coalition massed troops on her borders. British ships blockaded her ports. The revolution was surrounded. The French army was ill-equipped, undertrained, and led by officers who had either fled or been purged. Defeat seemed inevitable. To survive, the convention resorted to desperate measures. A levée en masse, a mass conscription, was declared. Every able-bodied man was to serve. Industry was directed toward war. Farmers were told to supply grain or be punished. The nation was militarized. In the chaos, France innovated. New generals, often young and untested, rose through the ranks, including a Corsican artillery officer named Napoleon Bonaparte, whose time was yet to come. The revolution, threatened from all sides, braced itself. The fall of the Girondins. As 1793 unfolded, tensions between the Girondins and Montagnards exploded. The Girondins, increasingly seen as hesitant and elitist, lost the support of the sans-culottes. Jean-Paul Marat, ever the incendiary voice of the people, denounced the Girondins as traitors. Robespierre, now a dominant figure, demanded unity through radicalism. On May 31st, Paris erupted in insurrection. The National Guard, loyal to the Jacobins, surrounded the convention. 4 days, the city stood on the edge of civil war. On June 2nd, the convention gave in. 29 Girondin deputies were arrested. Their fall marked a turning point. The revolution belonged to the Montagnards now. The Girondins, many of whom had championed the Republic, were gone, victims of the very revolution they helped unleash. The assassination of Marat. In July 1793, Jean-Paul Marat was murdered. He had long lived in hiding, his skin plagued by disease, his politics by fury. He wrote from a medicinal bath, his pen dripping with venom, calling for the execution of enemies. On July 13th, Charlotte Corday, a young Girondin sympathizer from Normandy, gained entry to his home. She plunged a dagger into his chest. He died in his bath, a martyr to the cause. Corday was arrested, tried, and swiftly executed. Her calm demeanor on the scaffold stunned the crowd. Marat's death became legend. Artists painted him as a fallen saint. Robespierre wept. The sans-culottes paraded his image through the streets. But with his death, the revolution lost one of its most fervent and dangerous voices. Robespierre ascendant. After Marat's death and Danton's withdrawal from the political front, Maximilien Robespierre emerged as the revolution's leading figure. Known as the Incorruptible, he was revered by some, feared by others. The revolution, having claimed her husband and her throne, had now claimed her head. France, that ancient kingdom, stood transformed. A republic forged in idealism, baptized in blood, and bound now to a future uncertain. The terror was far from over. The terror intensifies, 1793 to 1794. The Committee of Public Safety, guardians or executioners. As the year 1793 drifted deeper into its second half, and the winds of revolution howled ever louder through the broken streets of Paris, a new force emerged, not with the glamour of kings or the fervor of mobs, but with the quiet precision of bureaucratic power. The Committee of Public Safety, initially created to safeguard the revolution, had now become its central nervous system. Like the unseen root of a great tree, it spread through every corner of the government and touched every citizen's life, from the baker in his flour-dusted shop to the poet whispering verses in his dim-lit attic. It was headed by 12 men, though it often felt as though only one name mattered: Maximilien Robespierre. Robespierre, with his narrow face and intense gaze, believed not in mere politics, but in virtue. He did not speak of policy, he spoke of purity. In his vision, the Republic could not merely survive. It had to be purified, cleansed of all that was corrupt, selfish, or treasonous. And so, through this committee, France began to turn on itself with surgical resolve. The committee oversaw the economy, the military, foreign relations, and most chillingly, the revolutionary tribunals. There, under flickering torchlight, justice became swifter and less burdened by evidence. If one was suspected of counter-revolutionary thought, it was often enough. As autumn gave way to winter, and the streets grew colder and darker, the committee grew more powerful still. France, under siege both from without and within, entrusted its soul to men who believed terror was not merely necessary, but virtuous. The law of suspects. And then came the law of suspects, a document as cold and sharp as the blade it so often led to. Passed in September 1793, It cast a net so wide that nearly anyone could be drawn in. Its language was vague, dangerously so. One could be arrested not only for counter-revolutionary acts, but for insufficient enthusiasm for the revolution. A raised eyebrow at the wrong moment, a careless phrase at a dinner table, an old aristocratic title in the family line. These became ropes by which the guillotine was lowered. The prisons swelled. Entire families vanished behind stone walls. Neighbors turned on neighbors. Friends hesitated before speaking. Children were taught to watch their parents. The guillotine, once a novelty, became routine. It stood now not only in Paris but in towns and cities throughout France. In the capital, it was moved to the Place du Trône Renverse, and its shadow grew long across the cobblestones. The terror, officially born in the convention's chambers, now had a name and a body, and the law of suspects was its heartless heartbeat. Revolutionary tribunals and the machinery of death. The revolutionary tribunals were neither slow nor impartial. In their dark halls, where the air was thick with whispers and candle smoke, verdicts were swift, and the sentence, nearly always death, was automatic. Judges no longer required proof. A man's demeanor, his associations, even his silence could be turned against him. Witnesses were optional. Defenders, often silent. The tribunal existed not to debate truth, but to execute ideology. Each day, lists were drawn up, sometimes scores of names. They would be paraded through the streets, past the crowds who had grown eerily accustomed to the rumble of carts and the crack of drums that heralded each execution. Marie Antoinette had already met her fate. But she was not the last royal. Nobles, clergy, poets, widows, and merchants followed. The blade did not discriminate. It was clean, efficient, and deeply impersonal. Sometimes, the accused went singing to their deaths. At other times, they wept for mercy. But always, the tribunal moved on. The Vendéan rebellion was brutal. The insurgents used guerrilla tactics, striking and vanishing. The convention responded with equal savagery. Towns were burned. Suspects shot on sight. General Turreau's infamous infernal columns laid waste to entire communities. Tens of thousands perished. Though the rebellion was ultimately crushed, it left a scar on the revolution's conscience. Here, in the green fields of western France, the revolution had met not aristocrats, but simple farmers, and crushed them just the same. Danton and Desmoulins, voices of reason. Among the towering names of the revolution, few loomed as large, or as beloved, as Georges Danton. Once a titan of rhetoric and leadership, Danton had begun to grow weary. The guillotine's ceaseless rhythm disturbed even him. Beside him stood his friend and protégé, Camille Desmoulins, a once fiery journalist who now wrote passionately for clemency in his paper, Le Vieux Cordelier. They did not call for the end of the revolution. Only for moderation, for mercy. But in Robespierre's new world, moderation was counter-revolution. Compassion was betrayal. In March 1794, Danton and Desmoulins were arrested. They were tried not for crimes, but for defiance. Their speeches at trial were thunderous, echoing through history, but the tribunal was unmoved. On April 5th, they were led to the scaffold. Desmoulins wept. Danton did not. He thundered to the executioner, "Show my head to the people. It is worth seeing." And so, another voice of reason was silenced. The Festival of the Supreme Being. On June 8, 1794, as spring warmed the air and flowers returned to the gardens of Paris, Robespierre stood atop a grand artificial mountain, dressed in sky-blue silk, holding aloft a bouquet of flowers and a torch. It was the Festival of the Supreme Being, his attempt to restore morality and spiritual reverence without returning to Catholicism. The people were to celebrate reason and virtue under the watchful eye of a higher, deistic power. But many watched in silence. To some, it felt forced. To others, theatrical. To many, it confirmed their fears, that Robespierre had crowned himself a new high priest. In the eyes of his enemies, and even his allies, Robespierre's light had grown too bright. The shadows lengthened beneath it. The festival, meant to unify, instead marked the beginning of the end. The Great Terror. The weeks following the festival were the bloodiest of all. In June and July 1794, executions skyrocketed. The law of 22 Prairial removed nearly all legal protections. Trials lasted minutes. Defense was disallowed. The guillotine worked without pause. It was called the Great Terror. Each day, wagons of the condemned rumbled through the streets. Cries rang out. Heads rolled. Paris became a city of whispers and mourning. Robespierre grew more isolated. He withdrew from the convention, rarely seen except when delivering long, inscrutable speeches. His enemies plotted. Even his allies grew uneasy. The revolution, having slain so many, now circled its brightest star. The fall of Robespierre. On July 27, 1794, or 9 Thermidor, year 2, in the revolutionary calendar, the spell was broken. Robespierre appeared before the convention. He denounced unnamed traitors, but refused to name them. Panic spread. Deputies feared he meant them. In a sudden fury, the convention turned on him. Cries of "Down with the tyrant" echoed. Robespierre was arrested. That night, chaos reigned. Robespierre was freed, then recaptured. A failed suicide left him with a shattered jaw. On July 28th, he was executed without trial, along with his closest allies. As his blood stained the scaffold, a strange silence fell over Paris. The terror, that monstrous child of the revolution, was dead. France, wounded and weary, now drifted into uncertain light. Thermidor and the Directory, 1794 to 1799. The Thermidorian reaction begins. The hot summer of 1794, still echoing with the clatter of Robespierre's fall, gave its name to a new phase of the revolution, Thermidor, the 11th month in the new Republican calendar. It was not merely a change in date but a change in spirit. Where the red of Robespierre's terror had symbolized Republican zeal, the white terror wore the cloak of royalist vengeance. Former Jacobins, sans-culottes, and radical sympathizers were hunted. In the south of France, violence erupted. Prisons were stormed. Mobs gathered in the night. In Lyon, Marseille, and Toulouse, old scores were settled. The guillotine returned to some towns, not under revolutionary banners, but under the guise of retribution. The government in Paris, now dominated by moderates, looked away. It neither sanctioned nor condemned. Perhaps it feared the mobs. Perhaps it sympathized. And so, while the capital grew quieter, the provinces burned in reverse. The Constitution of Year 3. In the summer of 1795, France sat down to write itself anew. The convention, bruised by years of instability, created a new constitution, the Constitution of Year 3, which would form the basis of the Directory. Gone was universal male suffrage. In its place was a system that favored property holders. Power was now held by two legislative bodies, the Council of 500 and the Council of Ancients. The executive branch would be composed of 5 directors, hence the name of the new regime. They were to be cautious men, none too powerful, each balancing the others. It was a government built not for glory but for survival. The constitution reflected a deep fatigue. It sought to stabilize the revolution without reigniting it. It was not idealistic, it was defensive. But in that caution, it planted the seeds of its own fragility. The royalist uprising of 13 Vendémiaire. Not long after the ink had dried on the new constitution, the new government faced its first true test. In October 1795, or 13 Vendémiaire, year 4, royalist sympathizers rose up in Paris. They hoped to reverse the revolution, to restore monarchy, to cleanse France of the years of chaos. They gathered by the thousands, armed and determined. The convention turned to a young general, Napoleon Bonaparte. With calm precision, he ordered the use of a whiff of grapeshot, artillery fired directly into the crowds. The uprising was crushed in moments. The streets of Paris ran red once more. Napoleon, only 26, became a national hero. His name began to spread beyond the barracks and into drawing rooms and salons. He had saved the Republic, but at a cost. The people saw now that the new government would not hesitate to meet force with force. The Directory takes power. By late 1795, the Directory was firmly established. The 5 directors who now ruled France were cautious men. They did not seek to inspire, they sought to survive. Their names, Barras, Carnot, Rubel, La Revelilipo, and Latournia, rarely stirred passion. They governed from elegant buildings, with bureaucratic efficiency. Laws were passed, taxes levied, wars managed. The reign of terror was officially over. And yet, corruption seeped into the corners of the regime. Elections were manipulated. Bribes became common. The Directory lived in fear of royalists, of Jacobins, of the army. In Paris, bread remained scarce. Inflation gnawed at wages. The people, having sacrificed so much for liberty, now found themselves governed by men who seemed to serve only themselves. Still, it was peace, of a kind. Economic struggles and famine. The years of revolution had broken more than crowns. They had broken the economy. Paper currency, once a symbol of revolutionary ambition, now collapsed in value. Inflation soared. Bread prices spiked. Famine returned to some provinces. Farmers refused to bring their goods to market, fearing they would receive worthless assignats. Urban workers rioted, demanding food and fair wages. In rural villages, banditry returned. The Directory responded with laws and proclamations, but few solutions. The people, once fired by ideals, now waited in lines, watched their savings vanish, and asked quietly whether the monarchy had, after all, been so terrible. The rise of Napoleon. And as the Directory limped along, a new figure rose ever higher. Napoleon Bonaparte, once an obscure Corsican artillery officer, had proven himself time and again. His Italian campaign of 1796 to 1797 was brilliant, swift, and ruthless. He defeated Austria's forces, redrew borders, and the rise of Napoleon and the end of the Revolution, 1799 to 1804. The coup of 18 Brumaire. In the early morning haze of the 9th of November, 1799, or 18 Brumaire, Year 8, something quiet but momentous stirred in the heart of France. Paris awoke under uncertain skies, unaware that by nightfall, the revolution, as it had once been known, would be over. Napoleon Bonaparte, returned from his Egyptian expedition, met with conspirators from the government. Among them, Emmanuel Sieyes, a political theorist, and Roger Ducos, a director disillusioned with the current state of affairs. They planned not another uprising, but a coup, a swift, almost bloodless transfer of power. Troops loyal to Napoleon surrounded the Council of 500. Inside, confusion and resistance mounted. Some shouted treason. Others fled. Amid the tumult, Napoleon entered the chamber, flanked by soldiers. There was no vote, no popular uprising, just force. The Directory was dissolved. In its place rose the consulate. The revolution, after 10 long years of idealism, fear, and reform, had found its end, not in peace, but in a man. Establishment of the consulate. Following the coup, the Constitution of Year 8 was drafted and ratified, not by free debate, but by plebiscite. 3 consuls were named, but only one mattered, Napoleon Bonaparte, the first consul. He presented himself not as a tyrant, but as a restorer of order. He kept the language of the revolution, spoke often of liberty, and promised stability. The people, wearied by years of instability, welcomed him. Under the consulate, government became efficient once again. The bureaucracy was cleaned. Taxes were reorganized. Roads and schools were repaired. France began to breathe more steadily. And yet, beneath it all, democracy faded. The revolution had birthed an empire in waiting. Centralization of power. As the months passed, Napoleon began to consolidate power. The legislative assembly remained, but it no longer challenged. Prefects were appointed to oversee regions, loyal to Paris, and thus to Napoleon. The press was censored. Dissent grew rare. Trials were swift. Napoleon surrounded himself with competent administrators, Cambyses, Lebrun, Fouché, men who served efficiently and quietly. The dream of citizen government gave way to a state apparatus, functioning, obedient, and precise. Even as statues of liberty remained in the squares, they became reminders of the past. Napoleonic reforms and the Concordat. Despite the erosion of democratic ideals, Napoleon introduced reforms that reshaped France in lasting ways. He established the Bank of France to stabilize the economy and reorganized tax collection to ensure consistency. Perhaps most notably, he negotiated the Concordat of 1801 with Pope Pius VII, ending years of strife between France and the Catholic Church. The Church regained status but lost control. Bishops were appointed by the state, not Rome. Religious peace returned, on Napoleon's terms. Meanwhile, schools were standardized under the lycée system. Merit replaced nobility. A new elite emerged, not born, but educated. Napoleon was not merely ruling, he was rebuilding. The Napoleonic Code. Among his most enduring legacies was the Code Civil des Français, better known as the Napoleonic Code. It brought clarity to laws long muddled by local customs. It enshrined property rights, contract law, and civil procedure. It abolished feudal privileges permanently. The code favored order over liberty, but it brought consistency. It placed the father at the head of the family, reinforced patriarchal norms, and limited women's rights. Yet it spread beyond France. Wherever Napoleon's armies marched, in Italy, Germany, Poland, the code followed. The revolution's laws, refined by the general, became Europe's blueprint. Foreign campaigns and peace with Europe. The early years of Napoleon's rule were marked by military success. In 1800, he crossed the Alps once more to defeat the Austrians at Marengo. France's enemies sued for peace. The Treaty of Luneville in 1801 and the Treaty of Amiens in 1802 brought temporary calm to Europe. For the first time in a decade, France was at peace. In this brief window of tranquility, the French people could see the benefits of stability. Clean streets, reliable markets, repaired churches. The cannons were silent, but they were still. In December 1804, in the great Cathedral of Notre Dame, Napoleon crowned himself Emperor of the French. Pope Pius VII attended but did not place the crown. Napoleon did so himself, an act symbolic of his independence. The title was new, but the moment felt ancient. He declared it the culmination of the revolution, but many saw it as its betrayal. The Republic was gone. The Empire had begun. Still, the people, weary of uncertainty, accepted him. Some cheered. Others watched in silence. A peasant from Corsica now sat on a throne once held by Bourbons. Reflections on the end of the revolution. As 1804 drew to a close, so too did the revolution. It had begun in the halls of Versailles, flared in the streets of Paris, echoed in the cries of liberty, and bled in the shadow of the guillotine. Now, it had crystallized into an empire. The old orders, monarchy, nobility, and church, had been broken and reassembled in new forms. Power once held by the people had been gathered into one man's hands. But the world had changed. The ideas unleashed, of rights, sovereignty, equality, could not be put back into silence. Though the revolution had ended, its spirit moved still, in books, in whispers, in the yearning for freedom. And as Europe braced for the Napoleonic Wars to come, the embers of the revolution smoldered quietly beneath the surface. The rise of Napoleon as emperor. The revolutionary fires of France had not yet cooled when Napoleon Bonaparte emerged from the smoke, a military prodigy and master strategist whose ambition dwarfed all that had come before. Born in Corsica in 1769, he rose rapidly through the ranks of the Revolutionary Army, riding the waves of political instability like a practiced sailor on stormy seas. By 1799, he seized power in a coup d'état and named himself first consul. But this was only a prelude. In 1804, within the majestic Cathedral of Notre Dame, surrounded by nobility, generals, and foreign dignitaries, Napoleon crowned himself Emperor of the French, wresting the symbol of divine authority from the hands of the Pope. This singular moment signaled that France, a republic forged in revolution, had now become an empire governed by one man. This transition did not come with the bloodshed of the Reign of Terror, nor with the cries of Jacobin zealotry, but rather with a disciplined march of soldiers and the meticulous crafting of law. The Napoleonic Code, instituted during this time, sought to preserve the ideals of the revolution: equality before the law, secular authority, property rights, but within a tightly controlled imperial structure. Though liberty and fraternity were curtailed, order and stability returned. Napoleon's appeal lay in his promise of greatness. To the French, exhausted from a decade of uncertainty, he was a savior, the embodiment of reason, progress, and national pride. Yet to Europe's monarchs, he was a usurper, the revolution in uniform, a threat that had to be contained. The Third Coalition and the Battle of Austerlitz. The monarchies of Europe formed alliances to stop Napoleon's expansion. The Third Coalition, made up of Britain, Austria, and Russia, coalesced in 1805, hoping to strike before the French war machine could solidify its gains. Napoleon responded with remarkable swiftness. The Grande Army, stationed along the English Channel and originally preparing to invade Britain, marched east with precision and discipline. The campaign was swift, stunning, and brilliant. On December 2, 1805, exactly 1 year after his coronation, Napoleon defeated the Austro-Russian forces at the Battle of Austerlitz. With deceptive tactics, he feigned weakness to lure the Allies from their strong positions, then unleashed a crushing attack that shattered their center. The battlefield, shrouded in morning fog and glistening with ice, became the stage for one of the most lopsided victories in military history. Austria withdrew from the war, ceding territory and influence. The Holy Roman Empire, which had stood for nearly a millennium, was dissolved in 1806. In its place, Napoleon formed the Confederation of the Rhine, a coalition of German states loyal to France. Europe was being reshaped, not by diplomacy, but by bayonets. The continental system and economic warfare. After Austerlitz, direct military confrontation with Britain, the last remaining power in the Third Coalition, seemed impossible. British naval dominance had been confirmed at the Battle of Trafalgar, where Admiral Nelson secured a decisive victory over the French and Spanish fleets. Napoleon could not defeat Britain at sea, so he turned to economic warfare. In 1806, Napoleon introduced the Continental System, a blockade intended to isolate Britain economically by banning European nations from trading with them. Any nation that traded with Britain would be considered an enemy of France. Ports from Spain to Russia were instructed to close their harbors, and French customs officers were deployed to enforce the policy. However, the Continental System proved difficult to implement. Smuggling became rampant, and many European economies suffered from the loss of British goods and trade. Britain, with its global empire, adapted more easily and continued to thrive, particularly in its colonies. Meanwhile, discontent in occupied territories grew. The economic strain weakened Napoleon's grip on Europe and planted seeds of resistance that would later bloom into revolt. The Peninsular War and guerrilla resistance. Spain became a crucial battleground in 1808, when Napoleon installed his brother, Joseph Bonaparte, on the Spanish throne after forcing the abdication of the Bourbon monarch. This move was met with fierce resistance from the Spanish people, who, alongside Portuguese allies and aided by British forces under the command of Arthur Wellesley, the future Duke of Wellington, launched a brutal guerrilla. Allies adopted a new strategy: avoid direct confrontation with Napoleon himself but attack his marshals and vulnerable positions. The decisive moment came in 1813 at the Battle of Leipzig, known as the Battle of the Nations. Over 600,000 soldiers clashed in the largest battle in European history at the time. Napoleon was outnumbered and outmaneuvered. After days of fighting, he was forced to retreat. One by one, his German allies defected. The Confederation of the Rhine collapsed. France was being surrounded, and Napoleon's once glorious empire began to crumble. The fall of Paris and Napoleon's abdication. In early 1814, Allied forces entered France from multiple fronts. The French people, exhausted by years of war and economic hardship, no longer rallied to Napoleon's call. Though he fought a skillful campaign on home soil, it was not enough. In March, Paris fell to the coalition armies. Facing pressure from his generals and with no hope of victory, Napoleon abdicated on April 6, 1814. The Treaty of Fontainebleau exiled him to the island of Elba, off the coast of Italy. He was allowed to retain the title of emperor, but his empire was gone. The Bourbon monarchy was restored under Louis XVIII. The 100 Days and Waterloo. Yet Napoleon's story was not over. In March 1815, he escaped from Elba and returned to France. His landing was met with awe and astonishment. As he marched toward Paris, soldiers sent to arrest him joined his cause. In a matter of weeks, Napoleon was back on the throne. This period, known as the 100 Days, was Napoleon's final gamble. The European powers immediately declared war. In June 1815, near the village of Waterloo in modern-day Belgium, Napoleon met a combined British and Prussian force. The battle was intense and closely contested, but the arrival of Prussian reinforcements under Blücher tipped the scales. Napoleon was defeated. He fled, hoping to escape to America, but was captured and exiled again, this time to the remote island of St. Helena in the South Atlantic. Napoleon's final years and death. On St. Helena, Napoleon lived under constant surveillance in the damp, windswept residence of Longwood House. He dictated his memoirs, reflected on his campaigns, and remained a figure of fascination and legend. The isolation, combined with failing health, wore him down. On May 5, 1821, Napoleon Bonaparte died at the age of 51. The cause was likely stomach cancer, though speculation persists. He was buried on the island, far from the nation he once ruled and reshaped. The legacy of the Napoleonic Wars. Napoleon's fall marked the end of an era, but his impact endured. The Napoleonic Code influenced legal systems across Europe and beyond. The redrawn borders and political shifts set the stage for future revolutions and wars. The idea that merit, not birthright, could elevate a man to supreme power lingered in the minds of many. Though monarchies were restored, they were never quite the same. The ideals of the French Revolution, liberty, equality, fraternity, had been carried across the continent, not by diplomats, but by soldiers under Napoleon's command. The wars he waged reshaped Europe, and his legend lived on in art, literature, and politics. The Napoleonic era had ended, but the revolution it rode upon, and redefined, would echo long into the 19th century. The Restoration and the Shadows of Revolution, 1815 to 1830. The Return of the Bourbons, Louis XVIII's balancing act. The year 1815 marked not only Napoleon's ultimate fall at Waterloo, but also the return of the Bourbon monarchy to the throne of France. Louis XVIII, younger brother of the executed Louis XVI, was restored to power with the backing of the victorious Allied powers. France was weary. Years of revolution and war had drained the country of its spirit and resources. The people, exhausted by turmoil, were prepared, at least for the moment, to accept the return of a monarchy, if it promised peace and stability. Louis XVIII was no ordinary king, however. He understood that the clock could not simply be turned back to the Ancien regime. Much had changed since 1789. The revolution had fundamentally reshaped French society. The nobility had been stripped of its ancient privileges. The church had lost vast tracts of land and influence, and new ideas about governance, liberty, and citizenship had taken root. Louis XVIII chose a moderate path. He issued the Charter of 1814, a constitution that established a bicameral legislature, guaranteed civil liberties, and recognized many gains made during the Revolution and the Napoleonic era. Still, it was a delicate balancing act. Royalists, particularly the ultra-royalists, many of whom had spent years in exile, demanded a full restoration of aristocratic privilege and a return to the old order. Liberals, on the other hand, wanted a constitutional monarchy with limits on royal power. The king's challenge was to govern between these extremes, to preserve his throne without igniting new flames of revolution. Louis XVIII walked this tightrope with measured caution. He retained the Charter of 1814 and constitutional monarchy. At the heart of Louis XVIII's regime was the Charter of 1814, a compromise between old and new, monarchy and revolution. This document, though granted by royal authority rather than won through political struggle, was nevertheless significant. It guaranteed certain civil liberties, such as freedom of religion and legal equality. It established a bicameral legislature, composed of a chamber of peers, appointed by the king, and a chamber of deputies, elected by a narrow property-based franchise. Though limited in its scope, it was a nod to representative government. The Charter retained many of Napoleon's reforms. The administrative divisions of France, departments, arrondissements, and communes remained intact. The Napoleonic Code continued to regulate civil affairs. The legal gains of the middle class were preserved, and property rights, particularly those acquired during the revolutionary confiscations, were upheld. This continuity reassured many who feared a return to the feudal privileges of the Ancien Regime. However, the monarchy retained substantial power. The king had the right to appoint ministers, propose laws, and dissolve the Chamber of Deputies at will. Censorship was reimposed, and political opposition was carefully monitored. Yet for many, the mere existence of a constitutional framework was a hopeful sign. It suggested that France might evolve into a modern constitutional monarchy rather than slip back into absolutism. The Charter became a symbol of possibility, a delicate vessel into which the hopes of liberals, moderates, and even some royalists were poured. But it was also a source of conflict. To the ultras, it represented a dangerous concession to revolutionary ideology. To radicals, it was an insufficient step toward true democracy. Thus, the Charter stood at the center of France's post-Napoleonic experiment, fragile and contested. Louis XVIII's foreign policy and European diplomacy. Internationally, the restored monarchy had to contend with the watchful gaze of the Allied powers. The Congress of Vienna, 1814–1815, had redrawn the map of Europe in the wake of Napoleon's defeat, restoring many dynasties and reinforcing the principle of legitimacy, the idea that lawful monarchs should be restored to their thrones. France, once the revolutionary aggressor, was now reintegrated into the European state system, though under strict conditions. Initially, France was occupied by Allied troops, and it was required to pay massive indemnities. These conditions were humiliating, but Louis XVIII and his foreign minister, the Duke of Richelieu, worked diligently to re-establish France's international standing. By 1818, through diplomatic efforts and a posture of moderation, France was readmitted to the concert of Europe, the alliance of major powers designed to preserve the peace and uphold the restored order. The king's foreign policy was cautious. He avoided territorial ambitions and sought to reassure other monarchs that France would not again become a revolutionary threat. At home, this meant suppressing radical politics and maintaining tight control over the press and public discourse. Though some viewed this as a betrayal of French sovereignty, others saw it as a necessary step in rebuilding the nation's shattered prestige. Louis XVIII's approach to foreign affairs was marked by a commitment to stability, even at the cost of national pride. His quiet diplomacy helped France avoid further isolation and ensured a measure of peace during a time of internal turbulence. Cultural conservatism and the return of religion. The Bourbon Restoration also brought about a renewed emphasis on traditional culture and religion. The Catholic Church, which had suffered greatly during the Revolution, regained a prominent place in French society. Though the Charter upheld religious freedom, Catholicism was declared the religion of the majority, and clerical influence in education and public life increased dramatically. Religious orders returned to France. Churches were reopened, and the clergy regained their former dignity and state support. Religious festivals and symbols, once scorned by revolutionary fervor, were reinstated with solemnity. In schools, catechism and classical education replaced the secular curricula of the revolutionary years. This revival was welcomed by many who longed for a sense of moral order and continuity. After years of upheaval, the Church offered a stable anchor, a link to a pre-revolutionary identity. But for others, particularly liberals and former revolutionaries, this resurgence smacked of reaction and regression. They feared the clerical influence would erode the hard-won gains of the revolution. Culturally, the Restoration era was marked by a return to classical forms and themes. Neoclassical art and literature flourished, often celebrating monarchist and religious ideals. But beneath the surface, new voices, romantics, liberals, and dissenters, began to stir, laying the groundwork for the cultural and political ferment that would come in the decades ahead. The fragile peace and underlying discontent. Though the Bourbon monarchy had returned, and though the Charter had granted a veneer of liberalism, the peace that followed Napoleon's fall was far from complete. France may have been quiet, but it was not calm. Beneath the surface, discontent continued to simmer, among Republicans, Bonapartists, liberals, and the growing number of the disillusioned. The promises of the charter had given hope to many, but reality often. It became clear that the new king sought to reassert the divine right of kings and the sanctity of the ancien regime. He surrounded himself with ultra-royalist advisors, reinstated ceremonies and traditions that many considered archaic, and strengthened the power of the church. One of his early acts was to provide generous compensation to émigrés who had lost property during the revolution, paid for by the state. This act, though welcomed by aristocrats, further alienated the lower and middle classes, who bore the financial burden. Charles's reign marked a retreat from compromise. Censorship was intensified, political opponents were persecuted, and reactionary policies became the order of the day. The carefully maintained balance of the Restoration began to falter. Charles believed he could rule as a monarch of old, but France had changed. The years of revolution and empire had altered the very soul of the nation. The July Ordinances and the road to rebellion. By the late 1820s, discontent had once again reached a critical point. Charles X, emboldened by a sense of divine mission, took a series of steps that would lead directly to crisis. In 1830, following electoral victories by liberal opponents, Charles issued the infamous July Ordinances. These decrees dissolved the Chamber of Deputies, restricted the press, altered the electoral system to favor the aristocracy, and called for new elections under the new rules. They were a blatant attempt to override the charter and silence opposition. To many, it was nothing less than an attempted coup against constitutional monarchy, a return to despotism cloaked in legality. The reaction was swift and fierce. The ordinances, published on July 26, 1830, provoked an outpouring of anger in Paris. Journalists defied the censorship, printing protests and calls to action. Demonstrations erupted in the streets. Within days, barricades went up. The July Revolution had begun. It was not a revolution of the lower classes alone. Students, workers, members of the middle class, even some soldiers and National Guardsmen, all joined in the uprising. The tricolor flag, symbol of the revolution, reappeared above the rooftops. The memories of 1789 and 1792 were reborn in the chants and songs of the insurgents. Charles X had misjudged the mood of the nation. He had imagined France could return to 1788, but France had moved on. The spirit of constitutionalism and popular sovereignty had taken root. The people would not be silenced so easily. The fall of Charles X and the end of the Bourbon line. The July Revolution lasted only 3 days, but its impact was immense. Known as Les Trois Glorieuses, the 3 Glorious Days, the uprising of July 27th to 29th, 1830, forced Charles X to abdicate and flee into exile. The Bourbon dynasty, restored with such fanfare in 1815, had come to an ignominious end. Paris had once again become the cradle of revolution. The king, facing growing resistance and desertion within his own ranks, could no longer maintain control. Even moderate conservatives abandoned him, recognizing the untenability of his position. On August 2nd, Charles signed his abdication in favor of his grandson, the Duke of Bordeaux. But the people, and those in power, had other ideas. Rather than restore another Bourbon, a new monarchy was proclaimed, the July Monarchy, under Louis-Philippe, Duke of Orleans. A cousin of the Bourbons, Louis-Philippe had a reputation for liberal sympathies and had fought in the early years of the Revolution. He was styled King of the French rather than King of France, a symbolic shift that emphasized popular sovereignty over divine right. Charles X departed for exile in England, the same land where many of his ancestors had once sought refuge. His fall was seen by many as the final end of the old order. The Bourbons, who had ruled France for centuries, were no longer fit to govern a modern nation. Reflections on the Restoration and its legacy. The Bourbon Restoration, though often seen as a reactionary interlude between the Revolution and the modern age, was in fact a pivotal period in French history. It was a time of compromise and contradiction, when monarchy and liberalism uneasily coexisted, and when the past Restoration. But the question remained, who would rule France now? The answer came in the form of Louis-Philippe, Duke of Orleans, a man who positioned himself as a monarch of the people. Unlike the austere Bourbons, Louis-Philippe had a more bourgeois demeanor. He wore a simple black coat, walked the streets of Paris with modesty, and deliberately distanced himself from royal grandeur. His title, King of the French, rather than King of France, emphasized that his authority came not from divine right, but from the will of the nation. His coronation was devoid of religious pomp, and he swore to uphold a revised charter of 1830. The new regime promised liberty of the press, reduced censorship, and a broader, though still limited, franchise. To many, it seemed a new era had dawned, one in which monarchy and constitutionalism might live in harmony. But beneath the promise, complexities remained. Louis-Philippe's power still relied on a restricted electorate, composed largely of the wealthy elite. While he had the support of the urban middle class and moderate liberals, more radical Republicans and socialists felt betrayed. The working class, whose barricades had secured the July victory, soon found themselves excluded from the political order they had helped to create. Yet for a time, the regime held. France entered a period of relative stability. The economy grew, industry expanded, and culture flourished. But the very tensions that had haunted previous regimes, the divide between rich and poor, the limits of political participation, the demands of liberty, remained unresolved, quietly gathering strength in the shadows of progress. The Charter of 1830, Promise and Limits. The Charter of 1830, revised from its 1814 predecessor, was intended to signal a new beginning. Drafted in the wake of the July Revolution, it sought to balance monarchy with constitutionalism, order with liberty, and tradition with progress. Yet, as with so many documents born of compromise, it pleased few entirely and satisfied none completely. The most noticeable changes were symbolic. The fleur-de-lis, the emblem of the Bourbons, was replaced with the tricolour flag, reviving the spirit of the revolution. The king now ruled by the will of the nation, not divine right. The preamble acknowledged the people's role in shaping governance, a subtle but significant shift from absolutist principles. Censorship was formally abolished, and the Catholic Church was declared no longer the state religion, though it remained the religion of the majority. Deputies in the chamber were to be elected by a broader, though still property-based, electorate. The age requirement for voting was lowered, and eligibility for office was slightly relaxed. However, for all its liberal tone, the charter remained elitist. Voting rights were still tied to wealth, and only about 200,000 men in a population of 32 million could vote. France remained a constitutional monarchy, but one dominated by the upper bourgeoisie. The working class and peasantry remained politically invisible. Still, the charter established a framework for a freer press, for legal opposition, and for a measure of public accountability. It was far from democratic, but it was no longer absolutist. Louis-Philippe swore to uphold it, and for a time, he did. Yet as expectations grew and frustrations deepened, the limitations of the charter would become ever more apparent. The July monarchy was built upon a promise, but promises, once made, must be kept, or they turn into grievances. A bourgeois monarchy, prosperity and privilege. The reign of Louis-Philippe is often referred to as the bourgeois monarchy, a label that speaks to its character, its policies, and its patrons. Unlike the aristocratic grandeur of the Bourbons or the military brilliance of Napoleon, Louis-Philippe's regime was tailored to the aspirations of the middle class, businessmen, bankers, lawyers, and industrialists. This new elite thrived under the July monarchy. Economic liberalism flourished. The government encouraged railways, canals, and infrastructure projects. Commerce expanded, banks grew in power, and Paris began to transform into a modern metropolis, with iron bridges, gas lighting, and broad new boulevards in the planning stages. The king himself personified bourgeois virtues. He dressed plainly, dined modestly, and avoided courtly excess. His image as the citizen king was carefully cultivated, though in truth, he governed with considerable authority and a conservative instinct. While the upper and middle classes prospered, inequality widened. Industrialization brought new jobs but also harsh working conditions. Wages were low, hours long, and worker protections almost non-existent. Housing was often crowded and unsanitary, especially in the fast-growing cities. Strikes were illegal, and protests were met with repression. Peasants, meanwhile, remained largely detached from the urban drama, living quiet lives tied to land, tradition, and seasonal rhythms. They paid taxes, watched the weather, and remained skeptical of politics that seemed distant and irrelevant. This dual France, one prosperous, urban, and upwardly mobile, the other rural, poor, and voiceless, defined the July monarchy. It was stable on the surface, but beneath lay growing tensions between privilege and exclusion, wealth and want. The bourgeois monarchy succeeded in creating prosperity, but it failed to share it. And in that failure lay the seeds of future upheaval. The opposition grows, Republicans, Bonapartists, and Socialists. Though the July monarchy began with broad support among moderates, it did not take long for opposition to emerge from all directions. Its narrow electoral base, limited reforms, and repressive responses to dissent fueled the growth of rival ideologies that found root in the disenfranchised classes. Republicans, who had fought for a more democratic and egalitarian France, quickly grew disillusioned. They viewed the regime as a betrayal of revolutionary ideals: liberty denied, equality ignored, fraternity forgotten. In clandestine circles, pamphlets and manifestos called for a republic, invoking the memory of 1792 and the martyrdom of the sans-culottes. Bonapartists, too, remained a force, especially among veterans and the rural population. The legend of Napoleon endured, an emperor of the people, a man of action and glory. Though Napoleon himself was long gone, his nephew, Louis-Napoleon Bonaparte, began to gather attention. In him, many saw a potential return to national greatness. Meanwhile, a new and increasingly vocal force entered the political landscape: socialism. Thinkers like Saint-Simon, Fourier, and later Louis Blanc began to question the very structure of society. They criticized capitalism, called for workers' rights, and proposed utopian alternatives to the existing order. Though their ideas varied, they shared a common outrage at poverty, exploitation, and inequality. These currents, republicanism, Bonapartism, socialism, often diverged in aim and method, but they shared a frustration with the July monarchy. They flourished in the press, in underground societies, and in working-class neighborhoods. Each represented a different vision of France's future, but all stood in opposition to the status quo. The government responded with censorship, arrests, and surveillance. But repression could not kill an idea, it only scattered its seeds more widely. And those seeds were beginning to take root in the soil of unrest. The struggles of the working class. While the bourgeoisie celebrated growth and stability, the working class bore the cost of progress. In the factories of Lyon, the workshops of Paris, and the mines of the north, laborious worked long hours for meager pay. There were no unions, no protections, and no voice in the political arena. The 1830s and 1840s were a time of growing hardship for workers. Economic booms brought temporary relief, but downturns led to layoffs, hunger, and despair. Mechanization, hailed as progress, often meant unemployment for skilled artisans replaced by machines and cheap labor. In Lyon, the silk workers, or Canuts, staged two major revolts in 1831 and 1834. These uprisings were brutally suppressed, but they revealed the depth of working-class anger. The cries of live working and die working and bread or blood echoed through the city's narrow alleys. In Paris, political clubs and radical newspapers gave voice to proletarian frustration. The growing idea of le droit au travail, the right to work, emerged as a rallying cry. Thinkers like Louis Blanc began to advocate for social workshops, state-run employment programs meant to guarantee jobs and dignity. The government, however, saw workers not as citizens, but as a threat to order. Demonstrations were broken up, strikes banned, and leaders imprisoned or exiled. Each crackdown added to the grievances and to the belief that real change could not come through legal means alone. By the 1840s, the divide between the classes had grown too wide to ignore. Hunger marched hand in hand with hope, and across the land, the working class waited, not economic crisis and political paralysis. As the 1840s progressed, the stability that had defined the early years of Louis-Philippe's rule began to erode under the weight of growing economic hardship. The signs were slow at first, factories scaling back, markets tightening. But by the middle of the decade, France was spiraling into an economic downturn that would bring misery to thousands and expose the deep flaws of the July monarchy. Agricultural failure in 1846 proved catastrophic. The harvest was poor, and grain prices soared. Bread, the staple of life for the poor, became unaffordable. In cities, workers spent more than half their income simply to feed themselves, leaving little for rent, clothing, or medicine. The situation was even worse in the countryside, where peasants faced famine-like conditions. Malnutrition spread, and disease followed. Industry, closely tied to agriculture, suffered its own collapse. Textile mills laid off workers. Iron foundries halted production. Construction slowed. Unemployment rose sharply, especially in urban areas. Men who had once had steady work now stood in breadlines or wandered the streets in search of day labor. Hunger, cold, and hopelessness became the daily experience for France's working poor. The government, beholden to laissez-faire economics, did little to intervene. The belief that markets would correct themselves, that charity would suffice, and that state aid would create dependency prevented meaningful relief. Ministers debated endlessly, but their words brought no food or jobs. The king, once praised for his simplicity and thrift, now appeared distant and uncaring, a monarch out of touch with his people's suffering. Political paralysis took hold. The Chamber of Deputies, dominated by conservatives and businessmen, refused reforms. Petitions were ignored, protests suppressed. Newspapers critical of the regime were censored. The once vibrant energy of the July monarchy had congealed into rigid self-preservation. In the cafes, the factories, and the fields, the people whispered of change. They did not yet know what shape it would take, but they knew one thing with certainty: the current order could not last. Banquets and bans, the rise of political protest. In a France where political meetings were forbidden, reformers found a clever loophole: banquets. These elaborate, invitation-only meals became a way to gather, to speak freely, and to mobilize public opinion. What began as quiet social gatherings turned into a full-blown protest movement, all under the guise of dinner. Throughout 1847, the banquet campaign spread across the country. Organized by moderate liberals and Republicans, these events called for expanding the franchise and ending corruption. Orators spoke passionately about the injustices of a system where the vast majority had no vote, no voice, and no hope. Though these speeches were made over wine and roast chicken, their implications were revolutionary. The government watched nervously. The banquets drew large crowds and captured the public imagination. The conservative Prime Minister François Guizot, however, refused to yield. His infamous advice to the disenfranchised, "Enrich yourselves," only deepened public resentment. As the banquet campaign grew, so did tensions. By early 1848, the opposition had planned a final, massive banquet in Paris to demonstrate national unity and demand electoral reform. The government panicked. On February 22nd, it banned the event. The response was immediate. Students, workers, and reformers flooded the streets in protest. Demonstrators clashed with police. Barricades rose once again in the narrow streets of Paris. The chant of liberty rang out, echoing the revolutions of the past. The government, frozen by fear and indecision, hesitated. Louis-Philippe dismissed Guizot in an attempt to placate the crowd, but it was too late. The momentum of protest had grown too strong. The people of Paris were in revolt once more. What had started as a series of polite dinners had turned into a revolution. The fall of Louis-Philippe. The streets of Paris, in February 1848, were thick with smoke, chants, and defiance. Barricades sprung up like mushrooms after rain. The tricolor flag, once again a symbol of hope and rebellion, flew over the city. The National Guard, composed largely of the middle class, hesitated to suppress the uprising. Many of its members sympathized with the protesters. Some even joined them. Louis-Philippe, old and cautious, tried to maintain control. He promised reforms, spoke of new elections, and offered concessions. But the people no longer trusted him. His image as the citizen king had long since crumbled into that of a monarch more interested in business interests than in justice or dignity. As protest escalated, the king's inner circle urged him to flee. On February 24th, faced with the collapse of authority, Louis-Philippe abdicated in favor of his grandson and attempted to escape unnoticed. Disguised in a simple coat and hat, he slipped away from the Tuileries Palace and was soon on his way to exile in England, the same country that had once harbored Charles X. His departure was quiet, almost anticlimactic, but its impact was thunderous. The monarchy had fallen. Again, crowds surged into the chambers of government. The tricolour was raised over City Hall. Politicians scrambled to establish a provisional government. Among them were Republicans, Socialists, and moderates, now forced to cooperate in the creation of a new political order. The Second Republic was born not out of consensus, but out of urgency. There was no time to debate or deliberate. France had been hurled, once again, into the unknown. The Second Republic, hope and uncertainty. The establishment of the Second Republic in 1848 was met with jubilation and anxiety in equal measure. For many, it felt like a long-delayed fulfillment of revolutionary ideals. For others, it was a step into uncharted territory, one fraught with risk. The provisional government moved quickly. It declared universal male suffrage, giving the vote to every Frenchman over the age of 21. More than 9 million men. It abolished slavery in the colonies. It ended the death penalty for political crimes. Most importantly, it embraced the idea of the right to work. To fulfill that right, the government created national workshops, state-funded employment programs aimed at absorbing the jobless and restoring dignity. Thousands enrolled, working on roads, ditches, and construction projects. It was an ambitious and costly experiment, supported by figures like Louis Blanc, who saw it as the first step toward a more equitable society. But unity among the revolutionaries quickly eroded. Conservatives resented the growing influence of socialists. Moderates feared chaos. The middle class, once supportive, now worried about taxes, disorder, and the demands of the working poor. Debates turned bitter. The treasury struggled to sustain the workshops. Tensions deepened between Paris and the provinces, between workers and businessmen, between Republicans and Royalists. As spring turned to summer, the mood shifted. What had been a hopeful dawn now looked increasingly like a storm on the horizon. June days and the road to empire. The crisis came in June 1848. The government, under pressure from conservatives, decided to close the national workshops. For the thousands who depended on them for survival, this was a death sentence. Paris exploded in fury. On June 23rd, workers rose in revolt. Barricades once again cut through the streets. But this time, the government did not hesitate. Under General Cavaignac, the army launched a brutal suppression. For 3 days, the city was turned into a battlefield. Cannon were fired into working-class neighborhoods. Thousands were killed. Thousands more arrested or deported. The June Days uprising marked a turning point. The dream of a social republic lay in ruins. The revolution had devoured its children, and the Second Republic now rested in the hands of conservatives and the army. In December 1848, the nation went to the polls to elect a new president. The winner, by a landslide, was Louis Napoleon Bonaparte, nephew of the great emperor. To many, his name promised order, glory, and strength. He presented himself as a man of the people, yet one who could restore authority and stability. 4 years later, he would stage a coup, dissolve the republic, and crown himself Emperor Napoleon III. The French Revolution, born in 1789 with cries of liberty and equality, had taken a long, winding path through monarchy, republic, terror, empire, restoration, and back again. Its echoes would shape Europe for decades. And as the tricolour flew over Paris once more, one thing remained certain. The desire for justice, for dignity, and for the right to be heard would never be silenced.